Hey everyone, welcome to Zoom Time Knowledge. This is a free public education series hosted by the James Madison University Lifelong Learning Institute. Today we're joined by our special guest, Dr. Natalie Kerr. Natalie is a social psychologist and professor at James Madison University, where she teaches and conducts research. She's passionate about translating psychological research into practical strategies for improving people's lives, and her current research focuses on the social psychology of loneliness. Today's presentation is titled Proven Strategies to Increase Social Connection and Well-Being, Even During a Pandemic. And Natalie, I want to welcome you and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with our adult learning community. And I know that you've taught before the pandemic, you taught a course for us about loneliness. So this is an area that you were interested in, that you studied actively prior to the pandemic. And we know among the people that we serve, even before there was this pandemic, there was another one, the ongoing pandemic of people who experience isolation as a natural part of their daily life. And so we're really interested in what you have to share today, just as practical living tips for how to increase well-being.
Well, I am happy to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. And if you're able to show your video and allow me to see your faces, I would love to see them. This is all about connection, right? It's easier to connect when I can see you. But if you have, Wi-Fi issues or anything that makes it difficult, no obligation, but hi, Joe, Linda, Cheryl, Bill, Sue. Zoom is still weird. It's been a year, right? But isn't it still weird to interact this way? Makes connection a teeny bit more difficult. But I'm so excited that you're here, that you chose to be here. I know you have a busy day and it's a beautiful day outside. You could be outside, but you're here. And I'm excited to talk to you about research-based strategies for improving your sense of connection. So I'll start with a little bit about the benefits of social connection and the dangers of social disconnection, and then we'll get into the strategies. All right, so what are the keys to a happy, healthy, and long life? Well, experts would tell you a number of things, but mostly they'll say, get plenty of sleep, exercise, and eat right. But they often miss something. Something else needs to be on that list, and that's social connection. Research shows that our social relationships with friends, family, community, even strangers, have a huge impact on our health and well-being. In fact, research shows that our social life is as important as our physical health. So I'll share a little bit of the research with you. These are the results from a meta-analysis, which analyzed lots of research studies that followed people across decades, and they measured a lot of different variables, and including how healthy they were. And so what they came up with were the variables that predicted people's odds of dying early, dying prematurely. And this is what they found. So over here on the left, you see that breathing clean versus polluted air was a factor, but it was a pretty weak predictor of odds of dying early. Treating high blood pressure was a factor, but it was a pretty weak predictor as well. Being a healthy weight, being lean versus overweight, was a little more important, as was exercising. Getting a flu vaccine was important for avoiding an early death. Abstaining from alcohol. And then look at smoking fewer than 15 cigarettes a day. That was a pretty strong predictor. So it's important to not smoke if you want to live as long as you possibly can. So what about these other variables I have here? Having social support, being socially engaged, were they a predictor for how long people lived? Absolutely. And they were even more important than most of the other known risk factors for dying young. So what we found through this research and many other studies is that our social lives aren't just something that are nice to have. They're absolutely essential for our health and well-being and our longevity. So social relationships are a key to a long and healthy life. On the flip side of that, chronic feelings of loneliness increase your risk of early mortality by about 26%. And this is similar to the risk associated with smoking and obesity. So loneliness can literally kill you. It's quite surprising because we tend to think that, it's nice to have friends. It's nice to get together for, and go to the movies or have a Zoom happy hour, right? We think of that as something nice in our life. We don't tend to think about it as something essential, but it actually is. It's so important that we have people in our lives with whom we can connect regularly and meaningfully. So let's talk about loneliness for just a bit. This is kind of the depressing part of the talk. Later, we'll get into the happier stuff. But researchers define loneliness as the negative psychological state that arises when people are dissatisfied with the quantity or quality of their social relationships. So loneliness is a perception. So loneliness is not the same as being alone. Solitude is being alone. Loneliness is feeling alone. And there's a big difference. There are several people, even people I kept in touch with from the Lifelong Learning Institute class I taught, that are content being alone. They haven't really struggled with feelings of loneliness. So you can be totally alone even through a pandemic and be okay. You can be surrounded by people and feel lonely. So it's not the objective circumstance you find yourself in. It's just your feeling about it, how you feel about the state of your relationships. So researchers tend to measure loneliness with a variety of quantitative scales. This is one of the easiest. It's a 3-item scale. So they might ask research participants to indicate how often they feel they lack companionship, how often they feel left out, and how often they feel isolated from others. If you're interested in taking this and me scoring it later, we can do that during the Q&A portion of the talk. But this is how researchers quantify loneliness. What we have found through research over the last couple of decades is that loneliness is really prevalent. Even before COVID hit and social distancing guidelines became the norm, people were really struggling in this country and in other industrialized countries. In 2018, Cigna, a health insurance company, surveyed 20,000 Americans and found that nearly half reported feeling lonely, some or all of the time, nearly half. In 2019, Cigna put out a survey and found that 61% of respondents were lonely, sometimes or always. So we're seeing prevalence rates of loneliness that are, well, unprecedented. It is something that people call a loneliness epidemic. Some people might even call it pandemic, but the health experts agree that it is a huge and growing problem in the United States. The US Surgeon General, he was Surgeon General during the Obama administration and is now Surgeon General again. He wrote a lot about this. He was the first to sound the alarm about a loneliness epidemic. And when he was caring for patients, he wrote, "The most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness." He has a great book if you're interested in this topic. It just came out last year. It's called Together. But he writes a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And it's one of his priorities in his job as Surgeon General. So he is fighting the fight. What about COVID? How bad is COVID making things? Is the pandemic making the loneliness epidemic worse? I'm sure you've talked about this. You've heard about it on the news, read about it in the papers. There's a lot of talk about how loneliness may or may not be getting worse. And the research isn't totally clear, but here are a couple of studies. So a group of researchers who were studying loneliness before the pandemic found that, hey, since the pandemic hit, why don't we go back to our participants and ask them more about their feelings of loneliness? And so they measured loneliness in January, March, and April, and found no significant overall changes and reported that Americans were being pretty resilient. But they did find that older adults, loneliness levels increased in March and then kind of leveled off. So that was early in the pandemic. A little later, NORC, which is a research center out of the University of Chicago, found that more older adults reported feeling depressed and isolated than before the pandemic. So this was in the fall of 2020. So maybe researchers have done some studies in 2021, but they haven't been released yet. So it'll be interesting to find out how it changes. But, in sum, what's happening is that loneliness was already sky high before the pandemic, and it may be increasing slightly, but there's kind of like a ceiling effect. It can only get so high. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as social distancing guidelines are relaxed. Because as I'll explain, loneliness changes you. So it's not like you can have a season of loneliness where you were isolated and then just go back to normal. Loneliness changes you in surprising ways. And that can make it difficult to reconnect even when the pandemic ends and you don't have to wear masks and socially distance yourself. So let me talk about this. This research area is new for me. I actually spent the first 15 years of my career studying persuasion. And it was only in the last 3-4 years I decided to change and study loneliness because I read some stuff about it and it was shocking. It was shocking to me. I didn't really understand that loneliness can kill you and the nature of loneliness. So I'll share a little bit about what I've learned. Loneliness is not just an unpleasant feeling. It is that. It will make you feel miserable. But it is a biological warning system that it has evolved, just like hunger and thirst. So where hunger motivates you to get up and go to the refrigerator and thirst motivates you to go find some water, loneliness is an alarm system that says, hey, you need to pay more attention to your social relationships. You need to reconnect with your friends, or you need to schedule a movie night or a book club, whatever it is. It's a signal that you need your people. Or if you don't have people, you need to go out and find some people. And it evolved to be adaptive and to help us thrive and survive. So imagine life as a primitive human. So you're out on the savannah, you're living in a tribe, and you do everything together. You go out hunting together to get the food that you need to eat. And you find yourself separated from your people. All of a sudden you're alone and you're lost, you can't find anyone. This is a very dangerous situation, right? Back in those days, it was likely you could be prey. You could be eaten by a tiger, by a bear. You could fall into a hole and no one would be there to get you out. So you could literally, your life could be at risk. And so this system evolved to help you get into this fight, flight, or freeze response to help save your life. So to help you escape being eaten by a bear. But while you're out there on your own, separated from your people, you're, watching the landscape, surveying the landscape, looking for unfriendly faces, things that might eat you. You're mistrustful, you're anxious. And fast forward to modern day life, we are less likely to be eaten by bears, thank goodness. But that system is still part of us. That biological machinery is still there that we share with our primitive ancestors. And that is when we feel that lonely feeling, whether it's because we were exposed to COVID and have to self-isolate for 2 weeks, or we moved to a new town and don't have friends yet, that feeling is more than a feeling. It's actually making us hypervigilant to threat. It's making us scan that landscape for unfriendly faces. And so anytime we enter a social situation, we're guarded, we're on the defensive, we're anxious. We might not realize that. A lot of this happens outside of conscious awareness, but it happens. And that, as you can imagine, it interferes with your ability to really connect with the people in that environment. And so it can lead to like this vicious cycle where you're on alert, you want to connect, but that hyper-vigilant state, people can sense that and maybe distance themselves from you because it doesn't quite feel right. So it leads to this vicious cycle. People get stuck in the cycle of loneliness. So that's a little bit of the science of loneliness. Let's now talk about what we can do about it. Some of you probably are not feeling lonely at all right now, but still these strategies can help you boost your sense of connection and well-being. There's no limit. We can keep being elevated and feeling even more connected and more well. If you are feeling lonely, these strategies can help you kind of escape that vicious cycle and find the connection that you're craving. And keep in mind how prevalent this is. If you're not struggling, chances are one of your loved ones is, one of your neighbors is, for sure. So strategy number one is simply to check your alarm system. check in with yourself and see if you're feeling lonely. Are you feeling isolated and alone? If so, you need to acknowledge that, really understand the nature of that system. Don't deny it, right? If you go for 3 days without food, you're not going to deny your hunger. You're going to say, people, feed me, I'm hungry. So it doesn't make sense to deny any feelings of loneliness. So don't deny them. I know there's a perceived stigma associated with loneliness that makes it hard to talk about. But first, check in with yourself. If you feel that, acknowledge, it for what it is. It's just something that was designed to actually help you. But maybe it's kind of put you on alert. It's kind of activated your emergency response system. And so you just need to calm that down. You need to turn off the system. The body thinks that it's under attack, but you need to let yourself know that there are no bears out there trying to eat you. And one of the best ways to turn down that system is mindfulness meditation. Anybody in the room meditate? Any meditators? A few of you are, yeah. So mindfulness meditation has tons of benefits for the mind and body. This is yet another one. Several studies have shown that mindfulness meditation helps lower loneliness. It actually, when you become lonely, it ramps up your immune system, turns on pro-inflammatory genes. Mindfulness meditation can reverse that and make you less lonely and healthier. So give that a try. Build that into your life if you haven't already done so. Strategy number 2, find connection within. So often we think that when we're feeling lonely or just like we're missing people, like maybe we don't feel lonely, we're perfectly content, and yet we just can't wait to get out and go out to eat and to a concert or whatever. We think the solution is to get out there and to find people, but actually we can start within. So one of the most interesting findings to come out of this literature is that the benefits of social connection, the ones that make you live longer, they're actually linked to our internal subjective sense of connection, not our objective circumstances, which is good news when we're in a pandemic. So in a pinch, when we can't get out and find our people or be with our people, we can generate feelings of connection with just our thoughts. So I want this to be more than just a lecture. I want it to be interactive, and I want to invite you to do a social challenge. So we're going to do a very brief loving kindness meditation that's been found to help people enhance their sense of connection. So if you will, humor me, and just for a minute, we're going to meditate. This is a specific type of meditation called loving kindness meditation. If you want to turn off your camera because you're self-conscious meditating while on camera, feel free to do that. But if you will, close your eyes. Sit comfortably with your feet flat on the floor, your spine straight. Relax your whole body. Keep your eyes closed throughout the whole visualization and bring your awareness inward. Without straining or concentrating, just relax and gently follow these instructions. Take a deep breath in and breathe out. Keeping your eyes closed, think of a person close to you who loves you very much. It could be someone from the past or present, someone still in life or who has passed. It could be a spiritual teacher or guide. Imagine that person standing on your right side, sending you their love. That person is sending you wishes for your safety, for your well-being and happiness. Feel the warm wishes and love coming from that person toward you. Now bring to mind the same person or another person who cherishes you deeply. Imagine that person standing on your left side, sending you wishes for your wellness, for your health and happiness. Feel the kindness and warmth coming to you from that person. Now imagine that you're surrounded on all sides by all the people who have ever loved you. Picture all of your friends, your loved ones surrounding you. They are standing, sending you wishes for your happiness, well-being, and health. Bask in the warm wishes and love coming from all sides. You are filled and overflowing with warmth and love. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So if you were like research participants in the studies that measure the effects of loving kindness on connection, you felt a little more connected than you did maybe a minute ago. So this is an example of how we can generate thoughts of connection with our own thoughts. I'm not telling you that you don't need other people. So ideally you have other people that are literally standing near you. But when you can't have that, you can go within, tap within, and find that connection there. So connection is readily available to us whenever we stop and look within. All right, strategy number 3. So let's actually talk about other people and how they're involved in this. Strategy 3 is to maximize your minimal interactions. So when I survey my students and older adults too, and ask how they feel about talking to strangers, most people say they don't like it very much. Most people are reluctant to interact with a stranger, but research shows that people are happier and feel more connected when they do it. So there's some great research out of, they did a study at a Chicago train station, and they went up and asked commuters who were by themselves if they would rather keep to themselves on their commute into work or talk to a person who sat down next to them. And almost everyone said, I just want to talk to myself. I just want to sit with myself, keep to myself, and not talk to strangers. So that's the prediction. So the researchers recruited another group of participants and actually had them engage in an experiment and randomly assign them to either keep to themselves as usual or talk to the person next to them. And they were given a $5 gift card if they participated in the study. And then later in the day, they were sent a survey and asked how their commute went and how they were feeling right then and there. And guess what they found? They found that the people who actually stopped to talk to the stranger next to them had a more enjoyable commute and had a mood boost throughout the rest of the day. So we might like to think that we're better off just not talking to the random person at the bus stop or the person we cross when we're walking down the street. But actually it gives us a boost. People tend to think that talking to strangers might be awkward or I don't want to bother them. They look like they're reading a book and don't want to be disturbed. But research shows that actually most people who engage with strangers have a really positive interaction, and the stranger does too. So just a little nudge to maybe talk more to the strangers in your life during the pandemic and beyond. And you can do it in a COVID safe way now. If you have to go to the grocery store, engage in a discussion with the clerk. If you go to the Starbucks drive-through to get your coffee, talk to the barista. And you could do it online. Research shows that talking to strangers online gives you the same kind of boost. When you go to these Zoom type events, you can maybe chat with people when there's the opportunity to do so. So talk to strangers in a socially safe way. Strategy number 4 is related to this, and that is to make eye contact. I don't know about you, but I feel like, eye contact has been kind of declining as populations grow, and it's hard to acknowledge all of the strangers passing you when there are like hundreds or thousands of them. But I feel like since COVID happened and we've been wearing masks, I feel like strangers are less likely to make eye contact. Haven't seen any research come out on this yet, but that's my hunch. And research shows that when people aren't acknowledged, they feel disconnected. So they actually did a study where a research assistant went up to people on a college campus and either looked at them, made eye contact, or like kind of looked through them. So looked in their direction, but didn't make eye contact. And then they had a second research assistant come up behind and ask the person, hey, how connected or disconnected do you feel right now? And they found that the people who were not acknowledged felt more disconnected. So even if the norms are changing and it's becoming normative to not make eye contact, and not to say hello, maybe break the norm, maybe try to make eye contact with strangers. Strategy number 5, act extroverted. I don't know if you're like me, I'm super introverted. And I hear something like this and I'm like, no, this only works for the extroverts. This strategy works for all personality types. Research shows that people experience greater well-being when they act extroverted than when they act introverted. So they actually have people, they tell them to act extroverted to the extent that they can for like 5 days in a row and then act introverted. And they find that people are happier and feel more connected when they act extroverted. And it's true for extroverts and introverts. So it might be out of your comfort zone, but try it. Try to be even more extroverted than you are. And I know it's draining if you're an introvert. Social interaction is draining. I mean, I research social connection, and yet social connection just wears me out. I can only handle it in small doses. But if you're feeling a little disconnected, just kind of push yourself to act a little bit more extroverted. Strategy number 6. It's probably not super surprising to learn that people feel happier and more connected when they perform random acts of kindness. This is true for the person who does the random act of kindness and the person who receives the kindness. So social psychologists and positive psychologists study the conditions in which these acts of kindness have the maximum effect, right? And there is a science to it. You might not think of this as science, but it actually is. And so they vary different, ask people to try different ways of doing this. And they found that the best way to get a boost from this is to perform a lot of kindness in a single day. And the magic number is 5. So perform, and this is my challenge to you to do maybe sometime in the next week, perform 5 acts of kindness in a single day. And variety is key. So do 5 different things for 5 different people. And it can be simple. It can be a genuine compliment. Maybe you come into a Zoom class and you know how, especially if you're admitted early, there's kind of like some awkward time before things start. You're like, should I talk to people, not talk to people? Most people don't talk, but you can start talking, give somebody a genuine compliment. Oh, wow, I love your shirt, something like that. If it's genuine and it's a true act of kindness, it counts. Or it can be more intensive. Maybe you drop off a care package at a neighbor's house. Try to do 5 different things for 5 different people. And this could be done in a COVID safe way. If you don't feel comfortable actually being close to somebody, you could do it online. There's so many businesses struggling in Harrisonburg right now. You know what would help them? What would be a random act of kindness is to go online and write an honest review. One of your favorite restaurants, maybe you can talk about how much you love the food, right? So research shows that online acts of kindness give the same kind of boost as face-to-face ones. Strategy number 7, express gratitude. So you probably know that feeling gratitude is good for you. Expressing gratitude is good for your relationships. And yet people underestimate how positive recipients will feel if they express gratitude, and they overestimate how awkward it would be to like express gratitude or write a gratitude letter and give them to somebody else. But actually, when people are recipients of gratitude, whether it's a spoken word or a written letter, they don't feel awkward, they just feel joy. So another challenge from me to you is bring to mind someone who did something for you, for which you are extremely grateful, and someone you haven't like fully thanked. So actually stop and take a sec and think of someone, maybe an old neighbor, an old teacher, maybe it's a family member you don't see often, but did something really kind to you and you just never properly thanked them. Bring this person to mind. And if you're up for it, write a letter of gratitude to them and then deliver it when possible. Deliver it to them and have them read it. Research shows that this gives you a huge happiness boost and makes you feel more connected. So sometimes we think, oh, I should reach out to my old, Sunday school teacher and tell him how much like he changed my life. And you think, oh no, like he won't really appreciate that, or I'll feel awkward or something. Just do it. Like push through those expectations, because a lot of the research is showing that we're wrong about the benefits that these strategies will have for us. Strategy number 8, question your assumptions. So people, one of the most robust findings in all of social psychology is that people think they're better than average in most domains. So people think they're better drivers than their friends, that they're more intelligent, more creative, all of these things, most dimensions, we tend to think we're better than average, but this is not true when it comes to our social lives. It's so bizarre. But people often underestimate how good and rich their social lives are. People underestimate how much their conversational partners like them and enjoy their company. So they tend to be like, they're hesitant about approaching someone like, I don't want to bother them. And they're underconfident. Researchers call this the liking gap. Other research shows that people think that others lead more active, engaging social lives than they do. This is especially true for people on social media, because you're like seeing all of the photos of the things they've done, mostly pre-COVID. But you tend to think that other people have it better than you do. College students think that other college students have more friends than they do. And it's just not true. So we tend to be underconfident in our social life. So I would encourage you to question those assumptions. Be more confident, take more social risks. Strategy number 9, have deeper conversations. Researchers put on like tracking devices on people. It sounds kind of like futuristic, but they were tracking devices where they could learn what people were doing throughout the day. And then they had them record how they felt. And they found that people were happier when they had less small talk and more substantive conversations that were deep, right? So whenever possible, skip the small talk. I mean, if you're talking to the barista, maybe stick with small talk. But for someone you know a little better, try to go a little deeper. You don't want to go too far and be too invasive, but maybe think of questions you could ask that are not the run of the mill, hey, how are you? Need anything kinds of questions, but deeper and more specific. So, hey, what have you done in the last week that has brought you joy? Or what are you doing to take care of yourself in the pandemic? Try to get a little deeper. People appreciate that more and they feel more connected to you when you go deep. And sometimes you feel like, again, it's the underconfidence thing. You think, oh, I don't want to like pry. I don't want to come across as nosy, but people like it when you go deeper and you're vulnerable, when you share some vulnerabilities. And so when we're done, we're going to have, like, I'm almost done with the PowerPoints. We'll have a Q&A. And when we're done, if you want to stick around, we'll have, we'll ask each other some of the highs and lows of life in the pandemic, and we'll actually have a deep conversation. Strategy number 10, I could talk about this all day long. I'll just give you the highlights. You've probably seen a scene like this before, right? People in a restaurant or some public place where they're together, but they're not together because they're all looking down at their phones. I recently saw, well, the last time I was in a restaurant, saw a family of 4 and they were all on their devices, including the little kids, the entire meal, very little conversation. So this is taking a toll on our social lives. There's a lot of research out on this. Smartphone use undermines the emotional benefits of social interactions. Research shows, like they did a field study where they had people, they paid for them to have a meal at a restaurant and they were asked to put their phones away or keep them out. People enjoyed the meal much more when the phones were put away. It's not rocket science, and yet people, they know they would enjoy it more without the distraction of the phone, but they're so like addicted to their devices, they're always present. Smartphone use reduces the likelihood of social interaction altogether. They've done studies of waiting rooms, like in a dentist office, and found that when people had their phones, they were less likely to talk to other people. It also reduces smiles between strangers. You're less likely to give the smallest little acknowledgement of another human's existence when you're preoccupied with your phone. And it also causes parents to feel less connected to their children. I won't even get into the research on what it's doing to our kids. Social media is part of the problem here. It's not just the phone, but the social media is contributing to depression and loneliness, at least in college students. There's new research out showing that it is a contributor. It's not just a correlation. So, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I usually have to really kind of hit this one hard when I'm talking to my college students because so many of them are so addicted to their devices. But if you're one of the ones who has trouble putting it down, just keep in mind that when you're spending time on your phone, that's probably stealing some of your social connection. Final strategy, kind of a bonus, strategy number 11 is to experience more awe. There is a new blooming field of research on awe and awe-inducing experiences, whether it's from like being in nature and seeing a beautiful scene like this one off of Skyline Drive, or it's watching like a nature documentary, or even taking psychedelics. Different topic, we can talk about that later. But research is showing that people who experience awe feel a smaller sense of self, kind of like you're just one little teeny human in this giant world. And it helps you feel more humble, less egocentric, more pro-social, and more connected to humanity. So it has huge implications for our sense of social connection. So try to build more experiences of awe into your life. Again, this seems kind of like luxurious. Like I don't have time to like go to Skyline Drive. I don't have time to do these things, but it's good for your health and your well-being. So try to build in more awe-inducing experiences into your everyday life. Even if you have like a potted plant in your home and that's the only experience you have with nature because you can't get outside, just appreciate the beauty of the leaves or a rose petal, like peel it apart, petal by petal, and just appreciate just the beauty of that rose. So this can be good for your health and your well-being. So I'm going to end my part with just one more thought. So there's not a lot of research on this, but let's talk a little bit about Zoom. So you're here for the Zoom time lecture. You probably have been on Zoom quite a bit in 2020 and 2021. So there's not a lot of research out yet because it takes a while for people to do the research and then publish it. But some media and communication experts believe that Zoom is, it's a wonderful tool, right? Nobody's saying give up Zoom, especially in a pandemic when it's our only chance to connect with other people. It's great. And I know I've like had reunions with people I haven't seen in forever because of Zoom. So it's great, but it's so different than normal face-to-face communication that it's taking a toll. Zoom fatigue is real. That might be why, Rodney told me there's a class right before this. People coming out of a 2.5 hour class on Zoom might not want to go directly into an hour lecture on Zoom because it's exhausting. And there's some specific reasons why. Yes, so I won't get into all of it, but just give you kind of a hint and tell you where to learn more about it. So on Zoom, for example, you see your self-image. Like I've been looking at myself the whole time. I don't know why I left my image up, I guess because it's pinned. But you often see yourself. You don't do that in everyday life, right? In face-to-face life, unless you're like a dance instructor and you're actually in front of a mirror, you don't see yourself. And so it's weird. And it just takes cognitive resources that we normally don't have to devote. And then like, never mind, like, oh my gosh, like, has my roots, have they come in that bad? Like you're so distracted by your image, it takes away from being present with other people and people pick up on that. The number one thing you can do for your social life is to be fully present and fully engaged. And we can't do that if we're preoccupied. So, I mean, you can hide your self-image on Zoom. You like click those 3 dots, you can click that and hide self-view. So I recommend that. There are lots of ways that Zoom makes things a little harder for us. I'm not saying give it up. I'm just saying maybe try to make some tweaks to make it a little less taxing on yourself. So that's all for me talking. Now I want to interact and answer any questions that you have. I'd be happy to elaborate on what we've talked about so far or talk about other things you might want to know about.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to remove your spotlight, and if it's okay, we'll stop screen sharing so that we'll be able to see one another. One thing I want to ask is early on in your presentation, you had mentioned the stigma associated with loneliness. And I've always wondered, why is that, and it may be something that that if we're feeling lonely, that we ascribe ourselves as well. Like, why do we feel that there's something wrong with needing companionship? And is that shared across other cultures, or is it something peculiar to our own?
I think it is part of a larger mental health stigma. So there tends to be stigmatization about all psychological disorders, depression, anxiety. So it's part of that. Not that loneliness is a mental disorder, but it's just something about psychological conditions. They don't, people treat them differently. And it's changing. I mean, the mental health stigma is better than it was in the 1980s, for example. And I think the stigma around loneliness is a little better than it used to be, partly due to the fact that it's so prevalent. The media is covering it more. But we see this in European countries. I know research out of Europe that shows that it's highly stigmatized there. So I think it has to do with people attributing the condition to internal dispositional factors, believing that it's something about them. So kind of like feeling like a loser if you feel lonely, which is totally not right. I mean, lonely people don't differ from non-lonely people in terms of their social skills, how much they interact with other people, intelligence, attractiveness. There are no differences. So it's not like there's a reason for the stigmatization. Researchers did believe that lonely people had deficient social skills early on. That might have contributed to the problem. But we've learned since then that it's not that lonely people have deficient social skills. It's just sometimes they become so preoccupied with what's going on in their head that they fail to use those social skills when appropriate. So they might be a little more disconnected during social interaction because of all of the psychological busyness of their mind. But they have social skills. They're people just like you and me. I've had seasons of loneliness. So I think it's just people making the wrong attribution and thinking that something is wrong with them. Good question.
And I have enabled microphones. If others have questions or comments, you'll just be able to press the microphone icon to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to provide feedback, questions, comments to Natalie during this portion.
I was going to comment that I suspect that individuals who, for example, attend to these Zoom lectures and listening to people give new ideas, that in our community, most of us probably are outgoing. And the difficulty is reaching those who are lonely are not likely to participate in this sort of forum and learning things that they need to know. And I guess what I'm trying to formulate a question is, how do you reach to those people who would not inherently get themselves involved in learning these things, that their loneliness or being alone, there are ways to get out of that ditch?
That's a very good point. So the people who are actively involved in Lifelong Learning Institute's programs are probably much better off than the average adult, right? Because you're much more engaged. And yes, so I think the most vulnerable are the people not here today, who maybe they'll listen to a recording. Maybe they'll be more likely to listen to it without having to come into the event. Part of it is, once you experience a season of loneliness, you crave connection, and yet it makes you anxious to be with people. So it's kind of like this conflicting motives. And so maybe they won't come to the live thing, but maybe they'll listen to the lecture. I think personally inviting them would help. And I think it also helps that there's more coverage of this. I think one good thing to come out of the pandemic, I think, is a spotlight on loneliness. More and more people talking about it will lead to less stigmatization, which would make it easier for the most vulnerable to maybe speak up or at least like show up for something like this. But that's a really good point, Joe. It's hardest to reach the most vulnerable.
I would agree that because of the COVID, there's probably a lot of people who in the past felt lonely, but now they realize they are not alone in that feeling, because a lot of conversation has taken place on the media, and the very obvious fact that we can't corral. And if there are people who have never corralled and gone out bar hopping or whatever, they're home thinking nobody loves me or whatever, they now realize that they're part of a larger society. So hopefully, but again, I guess kind of the underlining question is how do we still reach them? That is, how do we maybe talk shows, or I mean, I don't know what a person who's clinically lonely and feel like there's no reason to live or whatever. I mean, really serious. I'm wondering how you connect with them, find them, and get them to get out of that foxhole.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I see that as a challenge, and that goes with economics, poverty, health issues, all that. I mean, it's really the same question for all of those areas where we know what's going on. We know there's ways of getting people out of that doldrum, out of that crisis mode that they may be falling into, whether it's loneliness or some sort of emotional thing, or economic or employment or whatever. We know what the answer is. It's that bridge that you have to build. And how do you, I see that as being the biggest challenge, because we kind of have answers, but you got to get it to them in order. It's like a vaccine. If you got to, it's great to have a vaccine, but you got to get to that person and inject them with that. So I see that as an uphill battle.
Absolutely. And, part of the stigma is you might know someone who's struggling, but you feel like awkward about approaching the subject with them. So you don't want to mention like, oh, are you feeling lonely? It's hard to ask somebody that. So maybe, you might have a neighbor who you suspect isn't getting out very much, maybe doesn't have family, lives alone, and you're worried. You could always there are tons of articles. That's one good thing. So like a New York Times article recently was talking about how COVID-19 was making the loneliness epidemic worse. You could send them the article, send them the link, or copy it and put it on their doorstep and say, this really resonated with me. Have you heard about this? So maybe not directly asking them, putting them on the spot, but just sharing some information with them. I know I went through a really hard time of loneliness. I moved to Harrisonburg for the job and I knew no one. And then I got married and had kids. And then I realized my kids don't have any family in this town. We don't have, there was no one who loved my kids as much as my husband and I did. And that made me feel really alone. And so there was a season when my kids were young, I felt so alone. And this was before I started researching it. And so I actually came across an article for work and saw how prevalent it was. And that made me feel so much better. I'm like, I'm not the only one struggling here. This is a very prevalent thing in modern times when we're so mobile and kids do leave home, for jobs, and everybody's so mobile, and just knowing you're not alone helps. So maybe being kind of casual about, hey, have you seen this article? Might really go a long way in helping them. A really excellent point, though. It's hard.
Yeah,
Yes.
Catherine, we have a note. You see it, Natalie.
I do.
About the importance of pets, and maybe you can speak to that if you've know of any research that supports that.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. I taught a class on loneliness for the Lifelong Learning Institute just February of 2020, right before the pandemic. And people were asking about pets. And I was saying, there's not a lot of research, but, anecdotally, of course, my pet makes me feel better, right? But since then, within the last year, there have been 2 studies that found pretty definitive evidence that, we've always known that pets make us healthier. So we knew that there was a link between pet ownership and health, but the loneliness piece was missing until very recently. So an article came out for adults in general and older adults that pet ownership can make you less lonely. And just being with pets, it doesn't have to be your pet. So you can, if you have a neighbor who has a dog, spend time with that dog. Whenever the dog is out, just pet it. The touch is another element. I didn't talk about this, but I think we're also deprived of touch. Even if you're not lonely, you might be missing out on touch, especially because you can't like hug people you used to hug and you're just not getting touch. Touch is essential for our health. It produces oxytocin, a hormone that makes us feel bonded and connected to other people, and we're missing out on that. But we can touch pets and let them touch us, sit on our lap and lick our cheek, you know? So absolutely, Catherine, I think that's a really good strategy, especially for people who live alone.
Natalie, you had mentioned your experience about moving to Harrisonburg, and it really mirrors my own. You know, my family and I have been here about 3 years now, or we will be in the fall. And much the same, moving away from family, relocating, resettling, beginning new jobs. So you have a new work family that takes some time to figure out how you all fit and to learn who's there to support you and explore common interests. And for the longest time, I imagine a lot of my contact beyond my household was first and foremost with Sue, you know, my colleague, just the two of us in lifelong learning. And being fortunate to have like a touchstone, you know, some place to start and anchor, and someone to bring you into a community. And then from there, of course, lifelong learners said, let me show you around town. There are people you need to meet. And this learning community has been so helpful to me that first year, opening so many doors, but just finding community there and community with people who I didn't have the advantage of having community with in the past. So through that conversation, I learned about aging. And I know one thing about our population, our adult learning population, is sometimes there are just natural processes that people find themselves suddenly housebound, and how a social circle can diminish during that period of life. And one of the most difficult things I imagine with that transition is maintaining those relationships, maintaining that contact, and making sure if we're on the other end of that relationship that we find time to visit or send messages or make phone calls. And hopefully during the pandemic, that's one thing that people have taken advantage of, these other ways of remaining connected and getting in touch. But I have heard several stories about how important that lifeline, literally it's been put that way, has been when people undergo a surgery that's going to take them off their feet for, you know, months at a time or a better part of the year, and they suddenly lose the connection that they did have. But totally, I just want to echo, it happens with moving, and it happens during other movements in life, and those transitions have been difficult. Thankfully, we're on the other side of it, but I'm glad to hear you are as well.
Yeah, I mean, the seasons of life definitely breed us. Like retirement is a big one. So like you said, it was Sue and the others in the LLI that kind of kept you connected. And then a lot of people experience loneliness after retirement because they had this kind of family of people they'd see every day, Monday through Friday, and then now they don't. And then, you know, loss of friends and loved ones. And yeah, it can be challenging. What's most surprising to people I talk with about this is that even though there are lots of opportunities for lonely times in older adulthood, older adults tend to be more resilient than the young adults. So Generation Z, like the youngest adults, 18 to 24, are the loneliest by far. And, you know, it depends. Some of the surveys show different things, like sometimes like what researchers call the oldest old people in their 80s and 90s tend to have a spike of loneliness. But what we're seeing is that the youngest adults are the loneliest. And I think it's tied to phone use. We could have an argument about that, but there's some evidence that it's due to them since middle school, a lot of my college students have been addicted to their phones and they haven't learned the social skills they need to build those connections. But yeah, it's an issue for people of all ages, not just one particular demographic.
I would think people in my age group, excuse me, we're a little more pragmatic because we've gone through the mourning process. We've lost loved ones over a period of time, parents, siblings, uncles, aunts, and all that. Whereas a young kid, teenager, early 20s, hasn't gone through that grieving process. And that's probably a different factor that hits them into a state of loneliness. Whereas for us old timers, I don't want to say we accept it, but we've been through the drill. A number of our membership are widowers, and who have decided to get out and move around it some more, and I won't say they seem to be super happy, but they've developed the technique of moving on. There's a number of people I've known where they don't have a spouse. In conversation, you're like, oh yeah, my spouse passed away 5-10 years ago. And yet, they're not, at this point in time, they've moved on. And I think at our level, I hate to use the word we're accepting it, but we're able to manage it more so than younger people would be. I was thinking, I have a couple high school buddies, they've all passed away. And I sometimes say, why am I still here? How is it that I haven't passed on? And, there's no answer to it, but I could see the potential of creating loneliness, saying I'll never be able to talk to my buddies anymore. They're gone. And, but it doesn't seem to impact me. I don't become lonely over it, but it might be a potential for someone else. I don't know. But at our age, I think we can accommodate it a little better.
Absolutely. I mean, you've learned the coping strategies. You know how to get through life's challenges better than the younger adults, for sure. What's interesting, it's not just a generational difference, but it's a time period difference too. So the youngest adults are lonelier than the youngest adults were 20 years ago. So like when I was in college, my cohort was less lonely and depressed and anxious than current young adults. So it's not only the fact that they're young, it's that they're young during, this era, modern life with smartphone, addiction. So yeah, but good point about the loneliness among people who have lost so many loved ones. I think I've seen that personally. I've seen quite a few people kind of fall into loneliness in that stage, but then I've seen others who are super resilient. I actually collected a little bit of data from Lifelong Learning Institute members back in the beginning of the pandemic and found that they were super resilient. Yeah, loneliness rates were really low, which is amazing. But again, I think the people who are actively involved in your program are probably not representative of all older adults. But it's fantastic that you have this.
Yeah, Natalie, we do wonder, as we hope to get back eventually to in-person learning, as people become fully vaccinated and more of our public is able to receive vaccinations, we hope people will rejoin a community like this or their faith communities, whatever community of support that they have. And we have seen participation rates drop off in the last year. Part of it's being online, I think. There's a technological barrier there. Some just prefer the social aspect that's provided by being together. You said it's different than it is online, and I think we all feel that. But we hope people come back. That's one of those things. For many, it's been like a gap year, right? It's where I have other priorities, my health being among the top of that list, and supporting others in their lives who are trying to survive through the pandemic. And as we get on the other side, maybe that provides a little more space for people to focus on themselves and try to thrive again. And maintaining social connection is going to be part of that. But one of my worries is that after a period of isolation, that might not happen. And so we don't know. We await as we get to the fall and we invite people to return. We don't know if they will come back. And it kind of goes to what Joe is, not knowing if people's internal and personal lives have been affected by such a long period of distancing. And I think that's something all of us are wondering is on the other side of the pandemic, do we come out differently?
And I worry that we will, because periods of isolation or feeling isolated, which is more important than your actual isolation, but it changes you. And I don't think people know that. And so you might be unaware that you're a little bit more mistrustful or anxious around people. And that can interfere with your ability to form those connections or to revitalize them, you know? So I worry a little bit. You know, with the Great Depression, my grandparents lived through that. They were children in the Great Depression and they were thrifty their entire lives, right? Even when they were well off and had the money to buy more aluminum foil, they refused to use that less than 100 times, right? Because they lived through that. And so, you know, there's historical evidence that something, you know, really life-changing, those changes can stick with you. So we'll see. I mean, only one way to find out. We'll see.
Bill, I see that you turned your video on. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. I'm not sure how to, can you hear me?
We can hear you and see you.
Okay. I don't do this very often. Just going back to your point about going online and so forth. On the other hand, from my point of view, one of the advantages of online classes is that the enrollment is unlimited. And I've been frustrated sometimes at classes that fill up before I can put my bid in. And I hope you will think seriously about offering classes both ways, if the instructor acknowledges that and so forth. But that's been I think, a positive thing.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. We are planning as we plan for our return, online, in-person, and hybrid classes when we find an instructor willing to teach in that format. And I mean, that's part of it, Natalie, right? Is accessibility, being able to join a community, particularly, and we've heard from some people, Bill, some who prefer to be at home, and then some who need to be at home because they're needed there. And that's particularly true of people who serve as caregivers in our community. Being able to still be present while someone's resting and then take a course and not have to choose between those two responsibilities to another and responsibility to themselves. Yeah, that they can meet both needs and be at home while doing it. So Bill, you will see some of those new formats that we will be sharing some of those plans in the coming week.
Good, very good.
I always like to pause if Fred, Cheryl, Catherine, Sue, if any of you have questions or comments, I want to give you the chance to do so. Well, Natalie, I want to thank you. This is an important conversation and I'm glad we're recording it because I can see it being helpful, not just now, but in the future. To people who come across a video, they see the headline, maybe they could be struggling or they know someone who could use the resources that you've provided and they can revisit it on demand. So thank you for allowing us to record. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your time, and your expertise with us. And I've got to say, you mentioned being introverted and the whole time that the presentation began, I thought there's so much positivity and energy. I'm just glad to be a student today because of your last class. I would get things started, and then we would go attend to other administrative needs, things where we were needed just elsewhere in different meetings. And one thing I value about Zoom is I get to remain connected the entire time, and I get the full experience. And I know that came into your talk too, not just that it's transactional, right? But that we do have an opportunity to be present, to feel connected, and for some real exchange to take place. And sometimes that's a reminder to me. It's just slowing that down, not running back up those stairs, but maybe lingering for a while so that people feel seen and heard.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have been here. And I have to say, like, seeing your faces is so energizing. And I know not everybody can turn on their video because they have limited bandwidth, but it's so important. I teach college students of traditional age who hate to turn their camera on. So I teach to like a screen of black boxes, and it like sucks the life out of me. So, I mean, talking about connecting, it's such a simple way to connect on Zoom. So to see your faces is just so, like I said, energizing. And I think do you see most people turning their videos on during these noontime lectures and other classes?
Not always. And part of the reason is the format that we've developed. A lot of times it's like there's a presentation portion, then Q&A. So oftentimes the videos are on before, like the class we had this morning, more than 25 people, but they know one another. And there's so much energy before we get started because they're all saying, how are you doing? Good morning. It's just a beautiful thing. And then we have the presentation where it's sort of interactions limited. The focus is on the presenter. But when we open it back up at the end, people re-enable their cameras, and then they have a lively discussion. So that's generally the way that they participate. But it is when we have a larger size group with a lot of cameras on, feels much different than you have a smaller group with all cameras off.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we have a bad hair day.
Well, I'm kind of glad that this was a smaller group, just because it is, the little things I think are important for connection. So I appreciate the questions, the conversation. And just one last point. When I taught the class for the LLI last February, we called it the loneliness epidemic. And in my evaluations at the end, and then during some conversations face-to-face, people said, I loved your class and I knew someone who probably could have benefited from it, but they were reluctant to sign up for a class on loneliness. So I really think that word matters. And so as we go forward and we're talking to people and we maybe encounter somebody who's struggling, maybe framing it a slightly different way, talking about the benefits of connection instead of the dangers of loneliness might be really important. Because that stigma, even though I kind of want to believe that it's changing and going away, it's still very present.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think about that. Language does matter, and framing either opens up the conversation or it might restrict participation, particularly if people feel vulnerable as part of that conversation. Well, Natalie, I want to thank you again. Appreciate all of your time for sticking with this. And even though it was a small group, I feel like we've spent a good hour together.